The first hard frost came early that year, sharp as a warning and quiet as a held breath. By the time the fields turned silver at dawn, folks along the county road had already made up their minds about her. They said she had lost good sense. They said grief had turned her strange. They said no one in their right mind would stack straw walls around a barn and call it wisdom. They laughed most when the wind began to howl. Her farm sat at the bend where the road dipped low and the snow liked to gather. It was an old place, older than most of the men who claimed to know better. The barn leaned just a little to the east, its boards weathered to a soft gray, its roof patched more times than anyone could count. The house behind it was small but sturdy, with smoke rising steady from the chimney most evenings. It was not a place built on pride. It was built on work. After her husband passed, the land had grown quiet. No more deep voice carrying across the fields. No more second pair of boots crunching through snow. Just her and the rhythm of chores that never paused for sorrow. She rose before first light, fed the hens, checked the fences, and hauled water with hands that had grown rough over the years. Some thought she would sell and move closer to town. Others thought she would fail before the first true winter set in. Instead, she began hauling straw. Not just a few bales stacked near the door for the animals. Wagon after wagon of it hauled from a neighbor's field after harvest. She stacked them tight against the outer walls of the barn, row after row, pressing them firm like bricks. She worked alone most days, her shawl wrapped close against the wind, boots sinking into mud that would soon freeze hard as iron. At first the neighbors watched with curiosity. By the second week they watched with smirks. By the third they were shaking their heads. "Straw soaks up water," one man muttered at the general store. "She have mold and mice by Christmas." "She's building a tinderbox," another added. "One spark and the whole place will go up." They spoke as though she could not hear them, though the walls in a small town carry words farther than any wind. Still, she said nothing. She paid for her flour, her lamp oil, and her coffee beans, then stepped back into the cold without a reply. What they did not see was the careful way she stacked each bale, the slight tilt she gave them so melting snow would slide off, the gap she left between straw and wood siding so air could pass and damp would not linger. They did not see her lining the inside of the barn walls with scrapboards, sealing cracks where a winter gust used to whistle through and freeze everything in their path. They only saw straw. By late autumn, her barn looked different from the others along the road. Golden walls wrapped around weathered timber, thick and solid. From a distance, it almost seemed like the barn had grown a coat for itself, ready to face whatever winter might bring. When the first snow fell, it rested on the straw in soft white layers, bright against the pale sky. That was when the laughter grew louder. Children pointed as their sleds slid past her gate. Men leaned on fence posts and made quiet jokes. Even some of the women, who knew what it meant to stretch a dollar and brace against hardship, exchanged doubtful glances. She carried on. Inside the barn, stacked from floor to ceiling, lay her firewood. Each log had been split by hand through late summer heat. Each piece was dry when she set it down, stacked tight and careful. In years past, heavy snow would blow through gaps in the barn walls and settle against the woodpile. Ice would creep in, and by midwinter she would struggle to find pieces that would catch flame without long coaxing. Wet wood meant slow fires, more smoke, and bitter nights. She remembered too many of those nights. This year, she meant to change it. As December settled in, the temperature dropped fast. The kind of cold that bit through wool and leather. The kind that made tree branches crack without warning. Snow came thick and steady, piling high against doors and fences. Drifts swallowed fence posts whole. The road became a narrow path carved by wagons and boots. On the coldest morning yet, one of the neighbors trudged up her lane. He claimed he was passing by. Claimed he only stopped because he saw smoke from her chimney and wondered if she needed help. His eyes, though, lingered on the straw walls. Snow had drifted deep around the base, but the bales stood firm. Not sagging, not dark with moisture, just holding steady. "You'll see come January," he said, not unkindly. "Winter's only begun," she nodded once. "Yes," she answered. It has. Inside her house, the fire burned bright and steady. No hissing from damp logs, no clouds of stubborn smoke filling the room. The heat settled into the walls and floors, warming the small space enough that she could remove her gloves and flex her fingers without pain. She did not boast. She did not invite anyone in to admire her stack of dry wood. She simply carried on with her days. Outside, the wind sharpened. It came in long, low whistles at first, then built into a howl that shook shutters and rattled loose boards. Storm after storm rolled across the county. Snow piled higher against barns that stood bare to the elements. Drifts found every crack and weakness. By mid-January, more than one farmer found himself chopping through ice just to reach his own firewood. Talk in town began to shift. "It's the damp," someone said near the stove at the store. "Wood won't catch proper. Had to borrow from my brother," another admitted. Mine soaked clean through. They did not mention her name at first, but they all thought of her barn at the bend. One bitter afternoon, when the sky hung low and gray as lead, she stepped into her barn to fetch another armload of wood. The air inside felt different from years past. Not warm exactly, but still calm. The straw walls muted the wind. Snow pressed against the outside, yet none of it had forced its way in. The woodpile stood dry and solid, bark rough beneath her fingers. She paused, just for a moment, and let herself feel something close to relief. Outside, hoofbeats sounded on the frozen ground. She set the logs down and stepped back into the yard. A small group had gathered near her fence, faces red from cold, eyes curious. One man cleared his throat. "We were wondering," he began slowly, "how that straw's holding up." She looked at her barn, then back at them. Snow clung to the bales but did not melt into them. The golden walls stood firm against the white world. "It's doing its job," she said. There was no triumph in her voice, just simple truth. They lingered a moment longer, shifting their weight, glancing at one another as though unsure what to say next. Pride is a heavy thing to swallow, especially when winter is pressing hard on your back. Finally, one of them asked if she might share how she stacked it so tight, how she kept the snow from seeping through. She studied their faces, men who had laughed, women who had whispered, children who had pointed. Then she nodded. Because that was the way of things, even in a town that sometimes forgot its manners. You helped when you could. You endured when you must. Word spread quickly after that. More straw walls began to appear along the road. Not as neat, not as carefully measured, but they're all the same. The laughter faded, replaced by quiet respect. Still, winter was not finished with them. Late one evening, as the sky darkened faster than usual and the air turned sharp with the promise of another storm, she noticed something troubling. A faint sag near the back corner of the barn. A place where the wind had been striking hardest these past few days. She walked closer, boots crunching over crusted snow. The straw there seemed looser than the rest. Not fallen, but not as firm. She pressed a gloved hand against it and felt the cold seeping deeper than before. Behind her, clouds gathered thick and fast. The wind picked up again, stronger than any she had felt that season. A low rumble rolled across the open fields. Inside the barn, her firewood waited, dry, safe for now. She stepped back, studying the corner carefully. If that section gave way, snow would find its path inside. And if snow found its path, the heart of her hard work could be undone in a single night. The first gust hit with sudden force, ripping loose flakes from the roof and hurling them sideways. The sagging corner shuddered. From the road, a lantern flickered. Someone was coming up the bend, fighting the wind. She drew her shawl tighter and faced the barn as the storm broke over the fields, knowing that what happened next would decide more than just the fate of her firewood. The lantern light wavered in the wind, dipping low and then rising again as the figure pushed through the drift at the bend. Snow lashed sideways, stinging her cheeks as she moved toward the back corner of the barn. The loose straw shivered under another hard gust. She could feel the cold pressing through that thin place, searching for weakness. The figure reached her gate and lifted the lantern higher. It was the widower from 2 farms over, shoulders hunched, hat pulled down tight. "You seen the sky?" He called over the wind. "I have eyes," she answered, though not unkindly. He came closer, boots sinking deep. "This one's worse than the others. They say it's rolling down from the north fast. Hard freeze after?" She glanced at the sagging corner again. The straw there had shifted, maybe from days of wind striking the same spot, maybe from snow piling too high at the base. She had packed it tight, tied it down with twine, braced it with old fence rails. Still, winter had a way of testing even the surest hands. He followed her gaze. "You need help shoring that up." It was not a question. The wind roared again, louder this time, making the barn boards groan. Somewhere in the distance, a shutter banged loose. She nodded once. Pride had no place in a storm like this. Together they waded through snow to the back corner. He held the lantern low while she pressed the straw back into place, testing how deep the looseness ran. Her fingers found a gap beneath the outer layer. Not wide, but enough that another hard gust could peel it away like dry leaves. "I can fetch rope," he said. "And another rail. Bring two," she replied. He hurried back toward the road, lantern bobbing through the white haze. She stayed where she was, bracing her shoulder against the straw as another gust slammed into the barn. The pressure forced air through the gap, icy and sharp. She imagined the snow following it, sliding inward, settling against her woodpile. Inside that barn lay more than firewood. It held her winter's hope. Each split log meant a warm night. Each stack meant she would not have to beg or borrow when the deep freeze came. When her husband was alive, they had weathered storms side by side. He would brace beams while she fetched tools. He would climb where she could not. The memory of his steady hands felt close now, as real as the wind against her back. She did not allow herself to linger there long. Memory could warm a heart, but it could not hold up a barn wall. The widower returned with rope slung over his shoulder and two sturdy rails dragged behind him. His breath came heavy, turning to frost in the air. They worked without much talk. He held the rail firm while she wedged it into the snow-packed ground, angling it tight against the straw. She looped rope around bale after bale, pulling hard until her arms burned. The wind fought them at every turn, tearing at loose ends, snapping twine against wood. At one point the lantern flickered low, nearly dying. He shielded it with his coat, and for a moment they stood in near darkness, the storm swallowing sound and sight alike. "You ever think," he began, voice low, "of leaving this place?" She did not look at him. "No, even after." He let the sentence trail off. Not because he meant 3 dots, but because grief was not something spoken cleanly in winter wind. "This land fed us," she said simply. "It will feed me still?" He nodded, though she could not see it clearly. He understood loss. The road between their farms had carried more than wagons over the years. It had carried news of illness, of accidents, of barns burned and crops failed. It had carried the weight of long winters that pressed on widows and widowers alike. By the time they tied the last knot, the sagging corner stood firmer, not perfect, but stronger than before. Snow whipped around them, but the straw held. "You should check inside," he said. "Make sure nothing slipped." She pushed the barn door open against the wind and stepped into the dim interior. The air felt still compared to outside. The straw lining muted the howl to a distant moan. She moved toward the woodpile, lantern light trailing behind her. The logs were stacked tight, ends facing out in neat rows. She touched the nearest one, feeling for dampness, dry, solid, no frost clinging to the bark. Relief settled over her, but only for a breath. Because as she turned toward the back wall, she saw something she had not noticed before. A thin line of pale light near the floor, just at the base where wood met straw. Not wide enough to alarm a careless eye, but they're all the same. She knelt, bringing the lantern close. The gap was narrow, maybe the width of her smallest finger. But beyond it, snow had begun to press inward, building slowly against the barrier she had made. The wind outside howled again, and the light trembled. She rose slowly and stepped back outside. "It's holding," she told him. "For now?" He studied her face, reading more than her words. "For now," he repeated. They stood together a moment longer as the storm deepened. Across the fields, other barns were barely visible, swallowed by white. Somewhere a dog barked, then fell silent. "You'll come by tomorrow?" he asked. "If the road's passable." He gave a short nod and turned back toward the bend, lantern light fading into the swirling dark. She closed the barn door and fastened it tight. Then she made her way to the house, shoulders bowed against the wind. Inside, she fed another log to the fire. It caught quickly, flame licking along dry grain. The warmth spread through the small room, steady and sure. She sank into her chair near the hearth, boots still on, listening to the storm press against the walls. Every creak of timber set her nerves on edge. Every hard gust made her picture that thin line of light at the barn floor. The laughter from autumn felt far away now. Winter had a way of silencing mockery. But it also had a way of exposing faults no one expected. She thought back to late summer, when she first decided on straw walls. It had not been sudden. The idea had taken root slowly, after one too many nights fighting damp logs. She had noticed how warm the chicken coop stayed when she packed straw thick along its sides. She had seen how snow drifted differently around tight stacks. She had spent evenings measuring, planning, testing small sections before committing to the whole barn. It was not madness that drove her. It was memory. The winter 3 years ago had nearly broken them. Snow had found its way through every crack. They had burned half-wet wood until the chimney smoked black and the air inside stung their eyes. He had coughed for weeks after. The doctor from town had blamed the cold and the damp. By spring, his strength was not what it once was. She had promised herself she would not let that happen again. The fire snapped, pulling her back to the present. Outside, something heavy struck the barn wall with a dull thud. Her heart jumped. She stood and moved to the window. Snow obscured most of the yard, but she could see the faint outline of the straw-covered barn. The back corner was hidden from view. Another thud followed, closer this time. Not wood splitting, but something shifting under strain. She grabbed her coat and stepped back into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her sideways. Snow filled her boots as she pushed toward the barn. The straw walls looked different now under the force of the gale. The surface rippled, small bits tearing loose and flying into the dark. She rounded the side carefully, bracing against the wall. When she reached the back corner, her breath caught. The rail they had wedged into place was still there, rope tight. But the snow at the base had risen higher, pressing heavy against the lower bales. And that thin line near the floor had widened just enough to show a faint trickle of powder slipping inside. Not a flood? Not yet, but enough. She knelt again, hands working fast despite the cold. She packed more snow tight against the outside, hoping to seal the gap with the very thing that threatened it. Her fingers went numb quickly, but she did not stop. Inside the barn, the wood waited in silence. Behind her, through the roar of wind, she thought she heard another sound. Not the storm. Not the groan of timber, footsteps. She turned her head slowly, snow stinging her eyes. Near the fence line, a shadow moved where no shadow should be at this hour. The storm swallowed detail, but she could tell it was not the widower returning. This figure stood taller, still against the wind, watching. Her heart thudded in her chest. No one else had reason to be out in a gale like this. No one who valued warmth and scents. The shadow shifted slightly, then stilled again. She rose to her feet, snow clinging to her skirt, and faced the figure squarely. The wind howled between them, carrying no words. The lantern light from the house barely reached that far. For a long moment neither moved. Then the barn wall shuddered under a violent gust, rope straining, straw bending inward. A sharp crack split the air, wood or rail she could not tell. She glanced back at the corner, knowing she could not stand frozen. Whatever that shadow meant, whatever business it carried, the barn needed her now. Another crack sounded, louder this time. When she turned back toward the fence, the shadow was gone. The crack came again, sharp and close, snapping her back to the corner of the barn. The rail had shifted an inch, maybe two. Not broken yet, but bending under the weight of snow and wind. The rope straying tight, fibers groaning with every gust. She forced herself to move. With both hands, she pressed against the lower bales, shoving them back into place. Snow slid down her sleeves and melted against her skin. The cold burned, but she hardly felt it. All she could think of was that thin line of powder creeping along the barn floor toward her firewood. Another blast of wind hit the wall broadside. The straw bowed inward and then sprang back, scattering loose bits into the storm. If the rail gave way, the entire lower section could slump. Once that happened, snow would pour in like water through a broken dam. She scrambled for a shovel she had leaned against the wall earlier. Digging fast, she cleared some of the snow piled too high against the base. The pressure needed to ease. She worked in frantic bursts, clearing a narrow trench so the drift would not press so hard against the straw. Her mind would not let go of the shadow she had seen. It had not been her imagination. The shape was too solid, too still. Someone had stood there, watching her struggle. The thought unsettled her more than the storm. In a small farming town, folks looked out for each other. They might laugh, they might gossip, but when weather turned cruel, they usually showed up with rope and shovel. Whoever that figure had been, they had not stepped forward. They had not called out. They had simply watched. The rail creaked again. She wedged the shovel under it and heaved upward, trying to force it back into firmer ground. The snow beneath had softened, packed and repacked by wind. It did not grip like frozen soil. Inside the barn, a thump echoed faintly as something shifted. She froze. Had snow broken through already? She dropped the shovel and pushed the door open, slipping inside with snow trailing behind her. The lantern she had left hanging swayed slightly. The air felt colder than before, a faint draft brushing her ankles. She hurried to the back wall. A thin spill of snow lay on the floor near the gap, no more than a small pile. It looked harmless at first glance, but to her it was a warning, a promise of what could follow. She knelt and pressed her palm against the lowest log in the stack. Still dry, but the powder had crept closer. Her breath came fast, clouding the air. If that drift grew, the moisture would settle into the wood. Not tonight, perhaps, but over days of freeze and thaw, damp logs meant smoke. Smoke meant coughing, long nights, and maybe worse. She stood and scanned the barn interior. The straw lining along the walls held firm except for that one corner. The board she had nailed inside months ago still stood straight. She had done everything she knew to do. Why that corner? It faced north. It bore the brunt of every storm. And beneath it, the ground dipped slightly. She had noticed the slope before but dismissed it as shallow. Now she wondered if meltwater had gathered there during earlier thaws, weakening the base. Another thud struck outside, then a scrape. Her heart jumped again. Not wind this time. Something dragged along wood. She moved quietly toward the door and cracked it open just enough to peer out. Snow blinded her at first, then she saw it. A figure near the fence again, half hidden by swirling white. This time closer. "Who's there?" she called, voice nearly swallowed by the storm. The figure shifted, then stepped forward just enough for lantern light from the house to catch the brim of a hat, younger than the widower, broader in the shoulders. It was the farmer whose land bordered the back of her property. The one who had laughed loudest at the store when talk of straw walls first began. "What are you doing out here?" she shouted. He hesitated, then walked a few steps closer. "Came to see if your barn was still standing," he said, though his tone carried something else. Not concerned exactly, she studied him through the blowing snow. "It is. Looks strained," he added, eyes drifting to the sagging corner. The rail groaned again, as if to prove his point. "You need something?" she asked. He rubbed his gloved hands together. "Heard some of the others are having trouble. Wet wood already. Thought maybe your straw idea wasn't holding like folks said." She did not answer right away. The wind filled the silence between them. Inside her chest, suspicion began to take shape. Had he been watching all evening? Had he hoped the storm would prove her wrong? There was pride in this county, thick as the clay soil. Some men did not take kindly to being shown a better way by a woman working alone. Another scrape came from the base of the wall. Her eyes flicked down. Snow had shifted, the trench she dug already half filled again. "You can stand there," she said evenly, "or you can help." For a moment she thought he might turn and leave. Instead he stepped forward, boots crunching through the drift. "What do you need?" "A second rail," she replied. "And we need to clear more snow from the base before it packs harder." He gave a short nod and moved to grab the shovel. They worked side by side, not speaking much. The storm did not allow for easy talk. As they dug, she watched him from the corner of her eye. His movements were strong, efficient, but there was tension in his jaw. Something unsettled. "Why were you standing back there earlier?" she asked finally. He did not look up. "Saw your lantern. Wanted to see how the straw was faring. You could have called out." He paused, shovel midair. Didn't know if you wanted company. She let that settle. It was not quite an answer. The wind shifted direction suddenly, slamming against the barn from the west. The entire wall trembled. The first rail snapped at one end with a sharp crack, sending splinters into the snow. There it was. The sound she had feared, the lower bales sagged inward at once. Snow pushed through the widened gap in a soft rush. Inside, she said, dropping the shovel. They rushed into the barn just as a heavier spill of powder slid across the floor. Not an avalanche, but enough to cover the bottom row of logs. He cursed under his breath and grabbed a spare board from the wall. Together they pressed it against the inside corner, trying to block the opening. Snow continued to seep around the edges. "You've got more rope?" he asked. "In the house. I'll fetch it." He disappeared into the storm again, leaving the door flapping. She braced the board with her shoulder, feet planted wide on the barn floor. The cold air pouring in felt like a living thing, reaching for the woodpile. Her arms shook from strain. She thought of the nights ahead, of the long stretch of winter still to come. If the firewood soaked now, all her work from summer would mean nothing. And deeper than that fear was another one she had not voiced. If her plan failed, the laughter would return. Louder than before. The straw walls would become a story told for years at the store, proof that she had been foolish to think she knew better. She had never cared much for pride, but she cared about being heard. The younger farmer returned, rope in hand and a second rail dragged behind him. His coat was crusted white, face red from cold. They worked fast. He wedged the new rail into the barn floor from the inside, angling it against the sagging bales. She tied rope around the board and through gaps in the straw, pulling until her hands burned raw. Snow continued to press in small waves, but the board slowed it. The rail steadied the wall enough to keep it from collapsing fully. For now, when they finally stepped back, breath ragged, the gap was smaller than before but not sealed. A faint line of snow still traced along the floor, creeping toward the wood. "This storm isn't done," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. They stood in the dim barn light, the sound of wind dull but constant through the straw lining. Between them lay the stacked firewood, still mostly dry but threatened. He glanced at the woodpile, then at her. "If it gets wet, you can bring some of mine." The offer surprised her. "Yours was damp last week." He gave a tight smile. "I've got some stacked in the shed by the house." "Better protected?" She studied him carefully. Was it kindness? Guilt? A change of heart? "Why are you helping?" she asked. He hesitated, eyes drifting to the wall. "Because I was wrong to laugh," he said finally. "And because if your straw holds, I'll be building the same come spring." Outside, the storm raged on, shaking the barn again as if to test the truth of his words. The board creaked under pressure. A thin stream of powder slipped through a crack near the bottom. She stepped closer to the woodpile, lifting one of the lower logs to check for dampness. The outer bark was cold, but still dry beneath. "How long can it hold?" he asked. She did not answer right away. Her gaze remained fixed on that creeping line of white inching closer to her stacked firewood. "As long as it must," she said softly. Another heavy gust struck, stronger than any before. The barn door rattled violently. The rail groaned, bending just slightly under renewed force. Both of them looked toward the corner at the same time. The rope fibers stretched tight, almost singing in the strain. And somewhere deep in the wall, something shifted again. The shift inside the wall was not loud, but it was deep. A dull grinding sound like something heavy settling where it should not. The rope tightened another inch. The rail bent just enough to make her stomach drop. Both of them moved at once. "Hold it," she said, pressing her shoulder harder against the board. He grabbed another plank from the stack near the door and wedged it crosswise, trying to spread the pressure along the inside wall. Snow hissed through the crack, thin and steady, brushing across the barn floor toward the firewood. The lantern light flickered as the wind forced air through unseen seams. Shadows leapt along the stacked logs, tall and nervous. "This wall won't take much more," he said. "It will," she replied, though she did not know if that was hope or truth. Outside, the storm reached a new pitch. The barn trembled from roof to foundation. It felt as if winter itself had decided to lean its full weight against her straw walls, testing every knot, every bale, every careful plan she had made back in autumn when the fields were gold and quiet. She thought of those early days again, of hauling straw under a clear sky, of neighbors watching from the road with folded arms, of laughter carried on mild wind. She had ignored it then. Now she could almost hear it beneath the storm, daring her to fail. Another crack sounded, this time from the roof beams above. Dust drifted down in faint clouds. "Roof's holding," he muttered, glancing upward. "Just the strain," she nodded, though her pulse raced. The snow at the base of the corner had built up again. Even from inside she could see the pressure pushing inward. The board they braced shifted half an inch under a hard gust. He shoved it back with both hands, boots sliding slightly on the barn floor. "We need to take weight off the lower bales," he said. "How?" "If we can clear more snow outside, reduce the drift pressing in." She shook her head. "It's piling faster than we can dig." As if to prove her right, another wave of powder forced through the crack, thicker this time, dusting the bottom row of firewood. She rushed over and brushed it away with her sleeve, checking each log quickly. Still dry underneath. For now the younger farmer wiped his brow, though the air was bitter cold. "If that rail snaps, we won't stop it from here." She looked at him steadily. "Then we make sure it does not snap." They worked without pause. He reinforced the rail with an old metal bracket he found near the tools. She tightened rope again, fingers numb but stubborn. They pushed bales tighter together from the inside, forcing the straw to compress and resist. Time blurred. The storm outside erased any sense of hour. All that existed was the wall, the snow, and the firewood stacked like a promise she refused to break. At one point the barn door burst open with a violent slam, wind roaring through the interior. Snow swirled in wild circles around them. She rushed to close it, fighting the force with both hands while he leaned his weight behind her. Together they forced it shut and dropped the heavy bar across. For a moment they leaned against it, breathing hard. "You could come to my place," he said suddenly. "Ride this out there. Bring what wood you can carry." She shook her head at once. "And leave the rest?" "It's just wood." "No," she said quietly. "It's winter." He looked at her, then really looked. Saw the lines of strain on her face, the stubborn set of her jaw, the memory behind her eyes. This was not about pride. It was about survival. About proving that careful work and simple knowledge could stand against harsh weather. Another deep groan came from the wall. The rail bowed further. The rope creaked like an old ship's line in rough sea. He stepped toward the corner again. "If this gives, we brace the woodpile itself. Keep it from falling," she nodded. "Stack tighter." Higher off the floor. They began moving the lowest logs up onto spare pallets, raising them just enough that creeping snow would not soak them quickly. Each piece felt heavier than the last. Their gloves were stiff with frost. As they worked, a thought pressed into her mind, unwanted but persistent. What if the shadow earlier had not been simple curiosity? What if someone had loosened something before the storm hit? The idea felt foolish, and yet it lingered. She remembered how the younger farmer had stood by the fence, watching. Had he been measuring weakness? Or had he been weighing his own doubts? "Did you notice anything earlier?" she asked, not looking at him. "Like what?" "Anyone near the barn before the worst of it started." He hesitated, stacking another log. No, she did not press further. Suspicion could fracture a town faster than cold. The wind howled again, higher and sharper than before. The barn shuddered violently. A loud pop echoed from the corner as the rope snapped at one knot, strands whipping loose. The rail jerked forward. They both lunged for it. He caught it with his shoulder, grimacing as the pressure forced him back. She grabbed the remaining rope and tried to retie it quickly, fingers clumsy. "Hurry," he strained. "I am." Snow poured through the widened crack now, not a trickle but a steady spill. It hit the floor and began to mound against the lower boards they had set up. She tied the knot tight and pulled with all her strength. The rope bit into the straw and held, for the moment. But the rail had shifted again, tilting slightly. He pushed harder, jaw clenched. "It won't take another gust like that." Outside, as if summoned, a new roar built across the fields. The sound rose from low to thunderous in seconds. She felt it before it hit. The air pressure changed. The barn seemed to hold its breath. Then the gust slammed into the north wall with a force that shook dust from the rafters and sent a shock through the floorboards. The rail cracked down the middle. He cried out as it split, one half splintering under the strain. The board they had braced inside snapped loose and fell sideways. Snow surged inward in a thick white rush, spreading across the barn floor like a breaking wave. "Back!" she shouted. They stumbled away from the corner as the lower bales caved inward, not fully collapsing but bowing deep enough to create a wide gap. Snow poured through, piling fast against the raised pallets and the bottom of the woodpile. The firewood stood just beyond the reach of the first wave, but if the gap widened any further, the drift would swallow the base entirely. He grabbed another plank, trying to wedge it across the opening, but the pressure from outside was immense. The straw walls that had stood firm for weeks now bent under the storm's full weight. She moved to the woodpile and began shifting logs higher, stacking them 2 rows above the rising snow. Each movement felt desperate but controlled. Panic would waste strength she could not spare. "Can you hold it?" she called. "For now," he answered, bracing the new plank against the gap. The barn groaned again, beams creaking overhead. Snow dust swirled in the lantern light, filling the air with fine white particles. She could hear the wind tearing at the straw outside, ripping loose small pieces that skittered across the yard. The golden walls she had built with such care were being tested like never before. Her thoughts flicked briefly to the rest of the county, to barns without straw walls, to firewood stacks left exposed. Was she alone in this struggle tonight, or were others fighting the same battle in the dark? The snow inside had reached the first pallet now, pressing against the lowest logs. She brushed it away quickly, but more slid in behind. "We need something solid," he said through clenched teeth. "Not just boards." Her eyes scanned the barn desperately. Then they fell on an old wagon wheel leaning against the far wall. Thick, heavy, iron-rimmed. "Help me with that," she said. They dragged it across the floor, boots slipping in the growing drift. He angled it toward the gap while she lifted from the other side. Together they shoved it into place, wedging it tight against the inside of the opening. The round frame caught against the straw and boards, spreading the pressure wider than a single plank could. For a heartbeat the snow slowed. They stood panting, staring at the wheel pressed into the wall like a shield. Another gust hammered the barn, but this time the wheel held, distributing the force along its rim. The rail fragments fell aside, useless now. The rope strained but did not snap again. The snow continued to seep in around the edges, but not in the same overwhelming rush. She stepped back toward the woodpile and touched the nearest log again, still dry beneath the cold bark. Outside, the storm roared at full fury, as if angered by the resistance. Inside the barn, 2 figures stood braced against winter itself, the straw walls trembling but not yet defeated. The wagon wheel creaked under pressure, the straw bent and groaned. Snow piled higher at their feet. And the longest night of the season was far from over. The wagon wheel groaned, but held its place against the gap. Snow still pushed through in small waves, yet the rush had slowed to a steady spill instead of a flood. She stood close to the woodpile, brushing powder away from the lowest logs again and again, refusing to let it settle. The younger farmer kept his shoulder pressed to the wheel, boots dug into the barn floor. His breath came in harsh pulls. Outside, the storm screamed across the fields, shaking the straw walls, but the worst of the collapse had been stopped. For long minutes they did nothing but hold. The wind battered the barn from every side, searching for another weakness. It rattled the roof boards and tugged at the door. But the north corner, the most fragile point, no longer bowed inward with the same terrifying force. The wheel spread the pressure wide, the reinforced rope held tighter than before. The raised pallets kept the firewood above the creeping drift. She felt the barn settle just a little, not fully calm, but less frantic. The straw walls that had seemed so fragile under laughter now proved their worth in the worst of winter. Gradually the roar outside shifted. The gusts still came, but the long violent blasts began to shorten. The wind no longer struck with the same steady rage. It rose and fell, as though tiring. He looked at her, eyes questioning. Feels like it's turning, she listened carefully. The deep grinding sound against the wall eased. Snow still pressed in through cracks, but not with the same force. The barn no longer shuddered from roof to floor. Maybe, she said. They did not move away from the corner yet. Not until the wind fell to a steady howl instead of a scream. Not until the rafters stopped trembling. Not until the wagon wheel rested firm without straining against their shoulders. When at last they stepped back, both of them were shaking, though not only from cold. The snow inside the barn had piled several inches deep near the gap, but it had not reached high enough to soak the wood. The bottom row remained dry where she had lifted it. She bent and split one log quickly with the small axe she kept near the stack, checking the inside grain. Dry. A long breath left her chest, one she had been holding since the first crack split the rail. He leaned against a post, rubbing his shoulder. You were right to build the straw walls. She did not smile wide or boast. She simply nodded toward the wheel wedged into the wall. It was not just straw tonight. No, he agreed quietly. It was planning. They worked for another hour, clearing snow from inside the barn, packing it away from the woodpile, reinforcing the wheel and boards where they could. By the time they finished, the storm outside had weakened to heavy snowfall without the violent gusts. When she finally stepped out into the yard, dawn had begun to soften the sky. Pale light spread across the fields, revealing a world buried deep under white. Drifts reached halfway up fence posts. The road at the bend had vanished entirely. Her barn stood there, wrapped in straw, scarred at one corner, but upright. He came to stand beside her, both of them surveying the damage. You'll need to rebuild that section come thaw, he said. I will, she answered, and I'll help. She glanced at him. The stubborn tension she had seen in him before was gone. In its place was something steadier, respect. Across the fields, thin threads of smoke began to rise from other chimneys. The town had survived the storm, but she knew not every barn had fared as well. By mid-morning, figures appeared on the road, trudging through drifts to check on neighbors. The widower arrived first, breath clouding as he approached. You both all right? He called. We are, she answered. He walked around the barn slowly, taking in the straw walls, the damaged corner, the packed snow. Heard the worst of it just after midnight, he said. Lost a section of my shed roof, she nodded, sympathy in her eyes. Firewood? Some got damp, he admitted. Without hesitation, she said, Take what you need. The younger farmer glanced at her, surprised. You'll need it, she added. Until we can help you fix that roof. The widower looked from her to the straw walls and back again. You kept yours dry? She opened the barn door and showed him the stacked firewood, raised above the snow, bark still firm and dry. He stepped inside and ran a hand over one of the logs, then shook his head slowly. I'll be lining my barn with straw next fall, he said. By afternoon, more neighbors came by, not to laugh, not to point, but to ask questions. They studied how she had stacked the bales, how she had left space for airflow, how she had angled the outer rows to shed melting snow. They examined the wagon wheel braced against the gap and the pallets lifting the wood off the ground. She explained everything plainly, no pride in her voice. Just simple knowledge earned through hard seasons. I watched how the chicken coop held heat, she told them. Straw is not foolish if you use it right. It blocks wind. It keeps snow from pressing straight against wood, but you must stack it tight. And you must watch the weak corners. They listened carefully now. The younger farmer spoke up then. She saved her firewood through the worst winter storm we've had in years, he said. While the rest of us are chopping ice, there was no bitterness in his tone. Only fact. Over the next week, as the storm settled into calm, cold days, men and women across the county began hauling straw. Golden walls slowly appeared around more barns. The general store talk changed too. Laughter faded, replaced by questions about airflow, drainage, and stacking methods. Her farm at the bend became a quiet example of preparation and steady work. The damaged corner of her barn was repaired before the next heavy snowfall. The younger farmer and the widower both came with tools and fresh rails. Together, they rebuilt the base stronger than before, packing straw tighter and reinforcing it with better bracing. No one mentioned the shadow she had seen that night. She never asked him again why he had been standing by the fence earlier. It no longer mattered. He had stayed. He had helped. In a small town, that was what counted in the end. As the deep winter months rolled on, her chimney smoke rose steady and clean. The fire inside her home burned bright without the hiss of damp wood. Even on the coldest nights, the warmth held. She often thought about that first frost morning when neighbors had already judged her choice. She realized then that people fear what they do not understand. They cling to old ways because they have always worked, even if barely. But old American farm life was not only about tradition. It was about learning from the land, from animals, from each harsh season. It was about adapting without losing heart. By the time spring hinted at thaw, her firewood stack had carried her through without trouble. The last of the winter storms passed quietly. Snow melted slowly, revealing fields beneath. One mild afternoon, she stood outside her barn, straw walls still intact though weathered. Children ran along the road, no longer pointing. Instead, they asked their parents if they could help stack straw next fall. The younger farmer approached, hat in hand. "I wanted to say something," he began. She waited. "I was wrong to laugh. Not just because your straw walls worked, but because I forgot that hard times teach hard lessons. You learned yours and used it. I should have listened sooner." She studied his face and saw no trace of mockery there now. "We all learn," she said simply. "Winter makes sure of that." He nodded and glanced at the barn. "I'll be building mine before harvest, and I'll come show you how to pack the corners." They both smiled at that. As summer approached and the fields turned green again, her barn no longer looked strange. It looked prepared, thoughtful, strong. The story of the straw walls traveled beyond their small county. Travelers heard of a woman who wrapped her barn in golden bales and kept her firewood dry through the harshest winter storm in memory. Some came just to see it, others came to learn. She did not seek attention. She simply worked. When autumn returned and the first chill touched the air once more, she stacked fresh straw around the barn again, this time with neighbors working beside her. There was laughter in the yard, but it was the kind shared over effort, not mockery. As she tied the last rope and stepped back to look at the golden walls, she felt no fear of winter. She had faced its hardest night and stood firm. The barn still leaned slightly to the east. The house remained small and steady. Smoke would rise again when frost returned. And along the bend in the county road, where snow liked to gather and wind liked to test every board, the straw walls stood ready, not as a sign of foolishness, but as proof that simple wisdom, steady hands, and quiet courage could carry a farm through the coldest season. In the end, the neighbors did not remember their laughter. They remembered the lesson. Dry firewood in winter is not luck. It is planning, it is patience. It is watching how the wind moves and how snow falls. It is learning from loss and building better next time. And on that farm at the bend, beneath a sky that had seen many winters come and go, that lesson burned warm and steady, just like the fire inside her home.